Hello, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. He's a designer and author specializing in mobile design strategy and user experience. His company, Global Moxie, provides consulting services to creative companies looking to build tap-worthy web and mobile apps. So please welcome Josh Clark.
Thank you, my man. Hey, everybody. As Frank said, I'm an interaction designer, but also what might be called sort of a design strategist. I work mostly in mobile. I wrote a book last year called Tap-Worthy about designing iPhone apps. I'm working on one now for O'Reilly about iPad apps. Basically, I fill my days helping people and companies think through crafting terrific experiences for basically non-desktop systems. And mobile has actually grown into quite a big category, and so it's really looking at how do you design for sort of non-traditional desktop environments. So that means figuring out how phones and tablets, for example, fit into an overall digital diet for companies as well as for consumers. But it's also about how these devices are creating entirely new kinds of interactions, something that we've been talking about a lot in this room today. New kinds of digital products and interfaces, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. How this explosion of new devices, and frankly, we're just at the beginning of that, sort of as scary and exciting and uncertain as it is right now with all these devices that are coming at us. Friends, this is just the beginning. And so I sort of look at how we have to create a new approach for design, not only in our interfaces, but also in terms of some workflows and the way we conceive of how we present our content. So I'm especially excited about the possibilities of touch interfaces. I believe that touch and the interfaces that it allows us to explore should force important fundamental changes in how we approach the designs of our interfaces. When you get rid of the mouse and the cursor, these prosthetics that we've been using to point at stuff for the last 25 years, all that's left is you and the device, you and the content, or at least that's the illusion that we create, right? That you're actually manipulating content directly. That tickles the brain in all kinds of new ways. And I think it suggests entirely new interfaces. I believe that touch is going to sweep away decades of buttons and tabs and folders and all this kind of administrative debris that we've accumulated over the last 3 decades. It's certainly very different from what came before and certainly very different from print. And so I want to talk about 2 things today. One is how we should and shouldn't go about conceiving these entirely new interfaces for news, and particularly in its relationship to print. And then look at some sort of nitty-gritty techniques for pushing touch interfaces forward in exciting new directions with gestural interaction rather than sort of the button presses that we've been working with for the last couple of decades. I think the iPad in particular is giving a lot of us an opportunity to experiment with these new touch interfaces in ways that smaller devices like phones kind of haven't allowed. And that's really exciting. But it also means that in all this experimentation, inevitably, we've been making a lot of missteps, which I think is, as sort of mentioned earlier, it's good. It's good to sort of have some bad attempts, that we have to be forgiving of ourselves and our colleagues as we kind of try stuff that doesn't necessarily work in these very early days of mainstream touch interfaces. So I want to sort of start with an awesome example of what I think we shouldn't do. Ladies and gentlemen, the globe of news. You guys know this one, right? This is the ABC News app, and it sort of pastes the latest videos in kind of like a new media paper mache project all over this globe, right? And it's a nifty kind of gimmick. It's a great interaction. It's the kind of thing when you first get your iPad, you want to show it to people, like, look at what my iPad can do. Can your computer do this? No, it can't. You know, you give it a swipe and you find out that, uh-oh, Lindsay and Paris are in trouble again. You know, another swipe, and we've got a giant carp in France and self-tightening shoes. Who says television can't enlighten? So sure, interacting with this thing is cool, and it's certainly very new, but the interface doesn't actually inform or enlighten, right? It doesn't organize the clips in any meaningful way. It actually keeps you from the content, kind of hiding and distorting it with this gimmick. I mean, look at this. You can really only see just 2 videos at a time, right? And then the rest are all just kind of crammed in there. Since they're not ordered in any sort of significant way, you actually can't, I might come back down here again, you actually can't sort of make sense of the entire amount of content. So it actually keeps you from the content, hiding and distorting it with this interface gimmick. So the interface here upstages the content without adding any useful value. Now this planet of news isn't the first planetary gimmick to fall short. Let's go back a couple hundred years. This is a model of the solar system from 1800. And check this thing out, right? What you do, right, is you turn this crank, and it in turn turns these gears, which are all different sizes. So you've got this thing that's coming all the way out here, and this demonstration of how the planets circle around the sun. You've got these moons going around Saturn. It's pretty badass, right? But when you're looking at this, you're not looking at the planets or the sun or the moon. You're thinking, wow, this guy really built this crazy, awesome device. You know, how did he make that happen? Edward Tufte uses this as an example of the sin of pridefully obvious presentation. More attention to the contraption than to the content that it's meant to illustrate. And I think we all know about this one, right? Sort of the inner show-off of the designer. As technologists, it's really easy to lose track of this, that it's the content that should define the app, especially in this business, the news business, not its machinery and not its technology. So as we create these new interfaces, as we explore the new possibilities, we have to remember that the goal is not to showcase the form. It's not to say, look, we've got a badass iPad app now. It's to showcase the content, to use the tools at hand to sort of present that content appropriately and in response to user needs. My friend Jeremy Keith said to me the other day that what we need to do is this. We have to build from the content out, not from the container in. In other words, let the content define the presentation, not the reverse. That doesn't mean that we can't deploy kind of awesome graphics and media. So let's sort of keep with this planetary theme before I return to sort of more traditional news. SolarWalk, a much more successful version of our model of the solar system. Sort of fly and zoom and swoop through the solar system. Like the ABC News Globe, it's a spiffy 3D experience, but it serves a purpose to underscore concepts of distance and time, these complex topics that are effortlessly explained by putting you in the middle of it. Only this very little bit of chrome here on the right, I don't know if you can even see in this light, there's this kind of scale here that if you move your finger up and down, it changes the speed of time, so the planets turn faster or slower, rotate faster or slower. So otherwise the app is all content, right? Very little artifice or interface. So the point here is that gee whiz graphics and interfaces can be a part of the future as we rethink our interfaces for touch. We'll look at some other innovative interfaces in a bit. But our new interfaces don't have to be jaw-dropping. They do need to emphasize, right, direct interaction with content. New York Times iPad app isn't very whiz-bang. Doesn't look new at all, right? Looks like the New York Times. A lot of people, and I'm sure that we've all heard it in this room, have criticized news media for being too safe. Come on, this is a brand new platform. All you can think of is to make it look like a newspaper. It's not for lack of imagination. This actually wasn't the team's original vision. Just step back, about 18 months ago to last January, 2 weeks before the iPad was announced. Apple secretly invited, right, a handful of people to Cupertino in the weeks before the iPad announcement to sort of prep demos. So among them were 3 young designers and developers from the New York Times, Andre Behrens, Jennifer Brooke, Adam Kaplan. They get there, Apple takes their cell phones so they can't call back to the home base. Basically throw them in a server closet with some scattered documentation and some really clunky, chained down iPads and says, all right, you've got 2 weeks, don't embarrass us. Don't embarrass Steve, who you're gonna be presenting to. So with only this very need-to-know information about the iPad, they scrambled to build the iPad, the New York Times demo, in 2 weeks. And they had their first concept running within the first 48 hours. This is the very first New York Times iPad app. It was based on a concept called the Deck, which Andre had developed in the fall in anticipation of iPad, very similar to the Times Skimmer, which is already there and part of a Chrome plugin now for New York Times. This is the first thing that they got up and running on the iPad. It's interesting, too. You sort of see a lot of the aggregators have arrived at something similar. You swipe up and down through sections, horizontally through the articles in the sections. They danced around for a little while, and were like, give us 2 weeks, we did it in 2 days. How do you like that, Apple? The problem then they sort of realized it wouldn't work. And one of the big reasons is that it didn't have anything to do with the visual brand of the New York Times, not just of the print brand, but of the web brand, which by now has been around for over 15 years too. So they realized that it was not their brief, as 3 under-30s, totally cut off from the mothership, to reinvent an entirely new brand on what was going to be this, kind of important platform, right? They didn't want to be jarring. On the contrary, they wanted comfort. Talked a lot about how this is a lean-back device, a comforting device, a device to relax with. So they wanted something that seemed more familiar. Same day, literally back to the drawing board, this is Jennifer Brooks' sketch pad from that day. And you can see that they're very quickly going to this very familiar newspaper layout. And this is what they came up with, the New York Times Editor's Choice it was called then. Very strong print metaphor, feels good, Familiar to read a newspaper that looks like a newspaper. A few quibbles, I think that even now they're still having some performance trouble. Memory management is really tough on this device. But a strong, if conservative, first effort, right? My point here by going through all this is to say a couple of things. One is, be true to your brand, right? Just because you've got a new device doesn't mean it's time to kind of go nuts, invent something that is totally out of keeping with who you are. But also, sometimes you can impress most by doing it quietly, by giving somebody the familiar. That's exactly the impression Flipboard made. Most of you at this point know about Flipboard, right? It takes all the links in your feeds, Twitter, Facebook, news feeds, and so on, formats it like a newspaper or a magazine. Remember when this thing came out? It caused quite a stir. It still does. New York Times and other newspaper apps come out, and the reaction is, looks like a newspaper. This comes out, and people are like, holy crap, it looks like a newspaper. It's for Twitter, Facebook, and RSS feeds, this was new. They somehow made your dizzy array of digital feeds look like this calm, staid newspaper or magazine, enormously successful. It tamed this chaotic torrent of news feeds for the calm sensibility of the iPad. So Flipboard is an entirely new interface, but only because it's using time-tested graphic design treatments. It marries the new with the old, right? It's a pleasure to read your feeds this way. Old interface conventions are not necessarily old-fashioned. So don't underestimate the power of humdrum, for lack of a better word. This interface revolution doesn't mean everything old must go out. In many ways, it's a return to the old and familiar. We have centuries of practice at making text engaging and readable. So it's important to try new things, throw everything we've got at the drawing board. We have tons of new opportunities and we should explore them. But I think we just also have to be aware that our enthusiasm for the new is also an Achilles heel. We have to have some sober moments to ask, does this make sense? Or is it a planet of news? It doesn't mean media and animation can't play a role. You can have an important cognitive impact, particularly if done subtly. So I want to talk about page flips for just 1 second, then I'll give that a rest. For at least a couple of decades, the magazine industry has come around kind of constantly and said, look, we've got software that will allow you to read your magazine on your computer. It's even got a page flip. It's like this was the thing in the 90s. Look, we can flip through the magazine as if that's what you've been waiting for to read Cat Fancy on your computer, is the page flip. So a lot of people in the design community, and I imagine a lot of the people here too, have commented that the page flip has been abused, right? That it's sort of overly kitsch, or worse, that it shows a sort of pathetic lack of imagination, that we can't get past our analog roots to invent something new for this platform. Here's a representative point of view. He's got a point, right? Bolting analog metaphors onto digital content can be too cute. These animations can be kitsch. They can certainly be distracting. You have to be careful. But I guess I would say that there's no particular charm in horse poo coming out of the back of your car. There is some charm and sentimentality and emotional attachment to that page turn effect. Now, I will say that this previous animation, it took too long, right? It's holding me back. It's getting in my way. It's distracting. But if you make it quick, it adds to the experience. It reinforces the physical touch metaphor. So unlike those sad desktop gimmicks, touch changes the experience. The page flip is window dressing, for sure, but the animation provides feedback to reinforce your design metaphor. Whether or not it's literally a page flip, almost everybody at least subscribes to the swipe and slide. And the page flip is just a different take on it. So I guess I sort of want to say, page flips are all right. Books and newspapers carry sentiment and familiarity. You guys are in a very good position here. Everybody loves their newspaper. They might not be willing to pay for it, but they love it. Fast animations that don't distract, that don't take too much time, and then kind of build on that familiarity. Now, I guess I want to say, I said this before, and when I say this, it also, of course, sort of by definition, also means this, right? Not every print convention should be honored. I feel a little bit sheepish talking about this on the heels of the last panel, but I think one example is I think that maybe we are a little bit too tied to the notion of bundling up our content in issues, of daily or weekly editions, sort of publish it all at once and then wait for the next batch. I think it's totally understandable that we do this. This is our history, this is our heritage, this is print. I'm sympathetic to this impulse, especially as it fits into existing print workflows, and it certainly kind of gives us a chance to sort of do a lot of great art direction all at once in one sort of bundled whole. But I think for users, it's somewhat limiting. It forces us into sort of a monolithic visual and navigational metaphor that doesn't necessarily reflect the ad hoc way that we gather information now. Issues are the way that publishers understand content. I think less so readers. As readers, we tend to be engaged more by individual stories. Before music downloads, remember how you had to get the whole album just to have the one song that you wanted? That's sort of, I think, what newspapers and magazines sometimes feel like today. It sometimes can feel like overhead, extra content that's bundled and sent my way whether or not I want it. Maybe you're not a sports fan. Why do you have that whole sports section? Why do you have to wait for the whole sports section, more importantly, just before you can sort of start reading this issue? So, why should I have to wait a week, Time Magazine, when you have the story today? Why the artificial embargo on content? I want to have my cake and eat it too. This is why Flipboard and Instapaper and Read It Later are so interesting, at least conceptually. Other apps that we saw this morning, aggregators like Trove and Zeit and Flood, Daily Me. One container for this whole universe of content from all providers that interest me. I think publishers and designers have to start thinking about content at a more atomic level, not in aggregated issues, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But aside from that behavioral shift that too many publishers ignore, I think there's also a simple technical issue, which I think that all the folks on the panel here are totally upfront about, which is just sort of there's the download thing. And who's familiar with this screen from the Daily? I know you are. This is what you get every morning or every evening when you fire up the app. And this screen, it lasts for several seconds, much faster than it used to be. It's slow to download to download entire issues at a time, to download every article that a newspaper published at once. And then you get this, so tantalizingly close. You can see the cover, but you can't do anything while it keeps loading. And then it finally loads, hooray. But oh wait, it's not quite done yet. So in the background, it's still going through stuff. I don't mean to pick on the Daily here. I just want to note that, first of all, that the art direction, I think, is lovely and innovative, as you saw if you were in this last session for all those apps. I think there's a huge amount of attention to detail that the issue-based approach allows. But you have this similar experience of having to wait across any issue-based app. It's the nature of the beast. And best of luck if your internet is kind of flaky. Everyone who does this issue-based work is working hard on this performance issue to try to make it as fast as possible. It's a serious hiccup. To their credit, the Daily lets you start browsing while it's still downloading, so even though I'm still at this 10% thing, I can still kind of get in there and get going while it's doing stuff in the background. Not all do, though. It took me 10 minutes of hotel internet time, which is 1 minute of normal time, before I could download and start reading a Time Magazine art issue today. New Yorker, even longer. On their websites, I was up and running in moments, right? It's a quote from venture capitalist Fred Wilson. He does a lot of analytics on his investment companies in terms of how fast they are. And he found that even microseconds of delay cause drop-offs in users and, of course, in revenue. Microseconds. What happens when we're talking 30 seconds or a minute? It's like people who are just like, doesn't work yet. It's not exactly fair. It's not like it's like, wow, 30 seconds to get an entire issue delivered on demand isn't a huge deal, but that is still sort of the unfortunate fact of life. One of the great advantages of native apps is this perceived performance advantage over the web. The UI can feel sleeker, faster, butterier, more capable than the web. Yet the web always feels faster than these issue-based apps. We're sort of giving up one of the big advantages just so that we can have something that's delivered like print and that we can own as a beautifully art-directed experience. We learned over the course of decades how to respect and anticipate slow internet connections. And with cellular internet, those lessons apply now more than ever. Downloading everything all at once is wasteful. And I guess one of the things that I'm worried about is that for our users, it might seem a little bit arrogant, too. I don't think that that's at all the intent. But I think that sometimes it's sort of like, here, take all of this at once. Doesn't necessarily do our readers a favor. So let's not lose all the lessons we've learned about delivering digital content over the web. We need to bring back some of those design patterns. But beyond speed, there's also, I think, another risk behind embracing digital content in sort of a monolithic view, an issue-based view, or even sort of saying, here's all of our content, and we're not going to let you out of our whatever, New Yorker content. It's sort of this sort of walled garden approach, both in terms of presentation as well as keeping people out, in and out. It's limiting, Recreating print designs and shoehorning print into digital media is, I think, limiting for business. I think that it's a bit short-sighted for revenue. I think it's limiting for designers, and I'll talk about that in a bit. I think it's limiting for users, where you don't necessarily have content that is the best suited for the device at hand. It doesn't seem that way at first blush. In fact, it seems like the opposite. So here's the New Yorker app, right, which, like most Condé Nast publications, directly repurposes its print designs into its iPad app. And it does so with some help from these folks. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with this. Adobe's digital publishing suite lets you take the work you already do for print and InDesign and morph them directly into an iPad app. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the gist. And wow, this seems to solve a lot of problems, right? Shift your print product onto the iPad without much extra work, no separate team. Condé uses their print design crew to do this, and we heard about Reader's Digest doing a similar thing. So from a business perspective, this seems great, right? Consistent, issue-based product across both print and, in this case, iPad. Very little additional overhead, so you get it, almost for free. From a design perspective, you do it with tools you already know how to use. You have people who already know how to use them. You have art direction that is strong and consistent across platforms. And so for Adobe, this is genius. This is a great business plan. It solves this immediate pain for publishers. But here's the thing. It's not the design that you want to repurpose, right? It's the content. This approach privileges print and its design conventions and imposes them on other platforms. Why? Why is that the best idea? You tell me, is print the winner looking out 10 years from now? Why should print's conventions dictate what happens on other platforms? Again, I'm not saying that we should disregard what we know about print. On the contrary, as I said earlier, I think there's a lot we can apply from our centuries of knowledge of print design. So I think we need to embrace what we know from print about the design of words, but also be prepared to jettison how we package those designs. The form and containers for our words is changing. It's not any longer about a monolithic issue or even a monolithic page. We have to be prepared to move in new directions that are appropriate to each medium. Or maybe to put it another way, don't be afraid to cannibalize your content. This is a question that was asked by Justin Smith, the president of The Atlantic, when he came on several years ago, and The Atlantic was sort of swimming in red. First of all, let's be honest. The Atlantic is the stodgiest, stuffiest magazine on the planet, right? Century and a half old. It's where the Battle Hymn of the Republic was first printed. Stodgy. 10 years ago, it was going bust, swimming in red. So this is the question that Justin Smith says he asked of the company at the outset of that turnaround. Here he's talking about business, but he might as well have been talking about their content. By ripping the Atlantic's content out of a print format and reformatting it, the content itself, not the print design, to lots of digital forums and businesses, the company is now very profitable. And this at a time when the economy and the industry itself is kind of plunging. So we have this unified, one of the things that they did is they unified print and digital staffs, no paywall, new digital properties, Atlantic branded conferences, just really sort of pulled out and blew out the content into all of these different forms, unbundling it to fit these new kind of containers, if you will. So here's what I'm getting at. Your product isn't really a product at all. It's not any one of these things. Your product is something called news. It's a service. The rest are all just containers. Products like Adobe's tend to focus on a single container, on an app. And that's what we're all running after in a panic right now, right? We've got to have an app. We've got to get on tablets. We've got to get on the iPhone. Oh, we've got to get on Android. Oh, we've got to get it on an Android tablet. No, maybe not yet. We've got to get on, we've got to get on Windows Phone. All these sort of things that we're just sort of chasing after app, device after device. But an app is not a strategy. It's just an app. So this is sort of thrilling but overwhelming time for all of us right now. We've got this avalanche of devices. It seems to be sort of pouring little glowing rectangles down on us. We've been taking them head on, one at a time. Develop the Android app, the iPad app, the iPhone app, Windows Phone, or the mobile website. And this is just the beginning. It's going to get much more chaotic, much more frenzied, more and more screens of all sizes, devices whose form won't fit our print designs, where this sort of Adobe magic won't work, devices without screens at all, devices that read to us in the car. How do we prepare for that? So I think it's really important as designers to step back from that kind of whirlwind for a moment, stop focusing so much on apps. It's not sustainable. I admire very much all of the apps that have been coming out of this industry for the last year. But I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think we can keep up with that sort of rich art direction and attention to every point of contact that we ship our content out to. Can't do pixel perfect for every time the content touches our readers or listeners or viewers. To pull back from this presentation, have to start with the content. And have to sort of accept that our content will take many forms. There's this growing mainstream expectation that you can simply get all your content from any device. We expect content to flow seamlessly, to follow us throughout the day. So this is this ad for NFL.com. I think it's a crisp illustration of that shift.
Welcome to NFL Network's coverage of this scouting combine. We have lots to talk about as the workouts get underway.
The NFL Draft is officially open.
Here are my NFL.com fantasy projections for 2011. Adrian Peterson's one of my top running backs.
This is NFL Red Zone, where you get every touchdown from every game. Touchdown!
Get the NFL. Anytime, anywhere.
We access the same content across multiple devices, phones, PCs, tablets, Xboxes, TV boxes, Netflix, the most popular devices that access Netflix now, PlayStation and Xbox. Kindle and Netflix, have really show that this is becoming a mainstream expectation. Where you finish reading a book on your Kindle device, and it's like, whoops, I'm out and about, but I've got my phone, I can pick it up right there. The content follows me at exactly the same spot no matter what device I'm on. Same for Netflix. The movie just starts up. No matter what device I was on, it knows exactly where I was watching. So I think this expectation is going to spread to even the most modest apps. I want my stuff everywhere, and I want it to know where I last dropped off. Our content is going to be poured into many forms, to flow into many different containers. many of which we haven't even imagined yet. I mean, seriously, it's like we're all sort of like, oh, who's going to win the tablet thing? It's like, oh God, it's only been a year old. Who knows what's going to happen next year? You know, 3 or 4 years ago, if anybody had said, oh, I'll tell you what's going to be big, a glass phone with no buttons, you'd be like, they're nuts. We don't know what's coming around the corner. Web designers, I think it's been really been drilled into web designers over the last decade to separate content from presentation. It's a hard shift for print designers when they move to the web. And I think we're going through that again now with mobile devices. That we can't just sort of shove out these rigid kind of print designs into an iPad. It doesn't scale well in terms of the resources that we have and the devices that we need to address. Instead, we have to think about interfaces as a spectrum of apps that plug into a single wellspring of service, little windows into our content. And what that means actually is that as designers, we need to start caring and investing and really pushing on the content side of things, to press for structured content, to build a common backend to serve all these interfaces that let you sort of turn and pivot to each technology and each device. So I guess what that means is that we need to stop thinking about apps specifically and start thinking more about flexible content. We came out of the 90s with our data locked up into all these legacy content management systems. And we finally got them into web content management systems to sort of liberate that content. But now we're turning out of the early web era with data locked up in these web CMSs. Content that's stored as messy, unstructured HTML, just big blobs of text that we can't break up, that we just assumed the page was always going to be the unit, the base unit of kind of conversation. I think that that's not true anymore. I think we need to think about the stuff in a more atomic level, that these CMSs have to be agnostic about what platform they're going to. That means there's important design work that has to be done behind the scenes in our CMSs, that we need these clean content repositories and APIs to deliver more neutrally formatted content to be displayed on any device, even devices, as I said, we haven't imagined yet. If we haven't even imagined these devices, we obviously can't really know the future, right? Which means that we can't be future-proof, but we can at least try to be future-friendly, try to anticipate the need to be flexible with our content. This website, Future Friendly, is a resource that I and a few other people put together a couple of weeks ago for kind of to nudge people into some big picture considerations for managing and escaping this kind of app-centric thinking. And the biggest lesson here, I think, at least for me as a designer, it's a strange thing for a designer to say, is that we can't try to control the form of our content in each and every context. We can't keep up. There's not enough of us for all the devices that are out there. So instead, I think we have to help our organizations to create well-structured content, to build the APIs that can send this content to any device context. Good news, you guys are already way ahead of everybody else. I mean, news organizations have tons of structured content. You know, that kind of structure allowed NPR, for example, to create this sort of central, neutral content management system and API that powers all of its services. Their website talks to the central content management system. Their news feeds do, their apps, their member station sites, all draws from sort of this one central, neutrally formatted repository. And now it means that they've been able to move extremely quickly, NPR, not exactly like rolling in cash, to deploy these new apps. They just build these sort of thin clients to ask for content and then display them in device-appropriate ways. And friends, that's control. You know, it's not necessarily about the art direction on one individual device. It's not about making everything look like print. It's about having the ability to creatively craft your content to fit the current context, no matter what device someone is using. So if we use that sort of structured content to build these smart APIs behind the scenes that will let you be nimble about adapting to new devices and contexts, news organizations have an advantage here. And that gives you more creative control. I mean, I think that there's a fear, it's sort of like, wow, if we just sort of send content out to these devices that we'll have less control. But I think this is the reason that we will actually be able to have more going into the future. It's a quote from an extremely bright, believe it or not, 18-year-old designer named Ethan Resnick. And what he means by this is that if you structure your content well, you'll give yourself more creative control in this sort of exciting and frankly dizzying world of connected devices. You'll have the hooks and flexibility that you need to put content where you want it, style it how you want it, in ways that are appropriate to the device. So Adobe's solutions and similar products fix, I think, a short-term pain. I think it's a great business concept that they've launched. But the real win, I think, for business value, for saving money going forward, as you sort of tackle all of these different devices, is not to sort of build them all one at a time. All the pain that we've gone through in the last year or two building apps, it's like, if we try to keep doing that in the future, it's not sustainable. Business value will save money. For creative control, as designers will have more control, and we'll also empower our users to have the content that looks right on their device. Actually, in creating content strategies and design strategies that aren't so tied to single presentations. All right. So those are sort of my thoughts on content, concept, and presentation. I do want to talk specifically about interaction design too, especially with regard to touchscreens and the possibilities that they create. So I'm sort of going to switch from sort of this high-level future stuff to sort of some more stuff about actual pixels. And so of course that means that I want to talk about an awesome Swiss Army knife. Ladies and gentlemen, the Wenger Giant. There's no Photoshop shenanigans here. This is an honest-to-God Swiss Army knife. You can get it at Amazon for just a little over $900. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, I'm totally going to get that. I guess not. It holds the Guinness World Record for most multifunctional pen knife. 87 tools that amount to over 140 functions. It's got a cigar cutter and a laser pointer. It's got a Gulf reamer, and my personal favorite right here. You see this? A key ring. You're not going to lose those anymore. So look, this thing is clearly ridiculous, but intentionally so. It was made for the 100th anniversary of the Wenger company, one of the two companies that makes the official Swiss Army knife. And their idea was, wow, for our 100th anniversary, let's take every gadget that we've ever made and put it into one bitchin' Swiss Army knife, and this was the result. So it's a fun bit of humor and whimsy from the Swiss. But as a knife, right, it's a failure. It's a pocket knife that won't fit in your pocket. The usability problems here are kind of obvious, especially if you try to use the toothpick. So I'm not going to linger too long on this, but I do sort of want to say that not only is this a heavy physical load at 4 pounds and over 9 inches long, it's also a heavy cognitive load, right? With 87 tools, just finding the one that you want is a challenge. With most interfaces, the more features that you have, traditionally, the more controls you need. A wonderful thing about using touch gestures is that they can let us remove controls, can let us remove some of this visual clutter to allow us to interact with more complex information in a more sort of effortless way without sort of this visual concern. So if we sort of, it lets us, in fact, I think a lot of people have been hinting at this today, that one thing that we really need to push forward in a community is stripping out buttons more, working directly with the content. Because frankly, on interfaces like the iPad and other tablets, these desktop conventions don't really work that well in the first place. Traditional controls feel really cramped on larger touchscreens like the iPad. So that tiny button in the top left of iPad apps, for example, is not particularly easy enough to hit, but I'm asked to hit it all the time. Lots of iPad apps follow the patterns you see here in the Mail app, where you have the split view for navigating layers of content. So I'm reading this riveting email from Facebook telling me about my friends' birthdays. But I want to pop out to my sent mail, right? So I have to hit this tiny target and navigate this series of tiny little buttons. I'm asked to do it all the time. And frankly, it drives me a little nuts. Fitts law comes into play here, right? Most of you probably know what Fitts law is. It describes how long it takes to hit a target with a tool or a pointer. So, sort of think about using a stick to push a ball towards something, or specifically we use it in our line of work often to talk about the effort that it takes to move a cursor to a target. And it really boils down to a pretty common sense conclusion. The smaller the target and the further away it is, the harder it is to hit. It's what makes golf such a miserable sport. Studies show that Fitts law applies to touchscreens too. The bigger the touchscreen, the more the model applies. On phones, the problem isn't as pronounced. You can pretty much hit the entire screen with a sweep of your thumb. On the iPad, you're moving your whole arm. You're dragging this giant meat pointer all the way up to the top corner of the iPad. So these buttons, even though they're the same size as the iPhone, much harder to hit, both cognitively and ergonomically. It takes concentration and effort on the iPad to hit those little things. This should always be our mantra as designers. Let me be as lazy as I want to be, which is very lazy. Don't make me concentrate on hitting little buttons. Let me swipe at the whole screen, not just a little tiny plot of it. A big screen invites big gestures. Do you even need a button for your app? Here's a game called Pinball HD. The entire screen is a button, or more properly, 2 buttons. Tap on the left side to trigger the left trigger, the left flipper, right side to trigger the right. It's worth thinking, what are the opportunities to eliminate buttons? And I'll follow that thought in a minute. First, I don't want to say that you should never use buttons. Particularly as we continue to develop a gesture vocabulary, we're going to need visible controls or hints to help people express abstract actions. Send to Twitter. I don't know exactly what the gesture is for that. I don't know. So some of these things we're still going to need, these sort of labeled buttons and targets like that. But that doesn't mean that we can't also have alternatives. Give me shortcuts. Gestures, especially the more abstract gestures, are the keyboard shortcuts of touch interfaces. They can let you get around a button press. So keep the button here, but give me a 4 or 5 finger touch as a shortcut to open those popovers. Again, this is an optional shortcut. It's a supplement to the button. And there are accessibility issues here too, right? Not everyone has 5 fingers. So there's sort of things that you want to sort of be conscious of sort of allowing the slow way around or the clunkier way, but then sort of letting expert users get the hang of using more supple gestures. Reader for iPad provides a good example. It's a newsfeed reader for reading your Google Reader feeds. It has a back button to return to your list of feeds, but you can also do a pinch to return to the menu directly. This fast, quick action that, again, uses the entire screen as a control. You can just sort of swipe at it. You don't have to hit that little button. Let me paw at the whole screen to take an action. I've been talking just here the last couple of minutes about the ergonomics of the button being a hassle. There's sort of too much thought or concentration and effort. But there's also a basic conceptual problem here. Buttons are a hack. And I'm not just talking about sort of in the software interface. This is true in the real world. Buttons are abstractions. They work at a distance on the primary object. They're often necessary, often the best possible solution. The hack is sometimes an inspired hack. Light switches, for example. Flipping a switch over there to turn on a light over here is not an intuitive action. That's something that has to be learned. That's why I'm always trapped in other people's bathrooms in the dark, feeling around. But it's a lot, so it's not obvious. It's separated, it works at a distance, but it's a lot better than walking into a dark room with a ladder and climbing up to screw in the light bulb directly. A light switch is an inspired hack. It's a workaround. Touch helps us, I think, manage complexity by getting rid of these visual abstractions to work with content directly. Like I said earlier, I think touchscreen lets us tickle the brain in new ways because it's more intimate to touch the thing that you're interacting with, to touch the content, to drag it around the screen, to move the content aside directly. Touching a button doesn't add intimacy. It's just a button. Again, it's this degree of separation from the thing you really want. I'm not saying that they're evil or bad, but recognize just that they're a hack, this workaround that we used to need to make desktop interfaces necessary. It's worth asking, do I still need that hack? Or can I manipulate the content or environment more directly? I'll show you examples in just a minute, but I guess just a broad observation is that our brains evolved to navigate physical space, to work directly with objects. Don't get trapped in the metaphors and hacks of this temporary alternate universe of the computer interface, designed for humans and designed for direct interaction. Twitter for iPad managed to eliminate the back button entirely. One of the developers of the app and the original developer of it, Lauren Brichter, told me that he hates the back button as much as I do. But it's his mission to kill the back button. So in this app, they really did. It's as you sort of tap through the content to go through stuff, the panel, right, slides over, the new panel slides in, so now you've got a stacked history see, we can actually swipe at the whole panel, right? Again, it's using the whole screen as a control, where every panel, every block is a representative component of the content itself, this very direct interaction. So something a little bit dreamier is this experiment, a doodle really, put together by a designer named Moritz Harman. It's a demo that he created as an example of navigating content without controls, just interacting directly with content. No buttons, right? You touch the word that you want, you touch the content that you want, and the thing sort of moves up this sort of history. Your current history gets larger. It feels a little odd at first, right? It's actually quite intuitive as you use it. Very kind of easy to get. And it's just, again, this very direct interaction of moving through stuff, just using the IKEA catalog as a sample content to show off this concept. Part of this does mean that we have to give up these old abstractions, though, and mental models that we associate with desktop controls. It's an app called TouchUp, which lets you draw filters or effects on photos. You brush these effects on, drawing them on with your finger, of course. So the very sort of simplest example is just drawing on a color. But what if you want a smaller brush? I mean, traditionally, you'd have a slider or some sort of brush selector, right? But the thing is, you don't have a brush. I mean, the thing is, you do have a brush. You already have one, and it never changes size, right? I mean, if you had a setting to sort of make the size bigger than your finger, now you have to really think about what exactly am I going to draw on. So instead of changing the brush size in this app, you change the canvas size. You pinch, you spread out you pinch to zoom in and out, then you draw your next stroke. So the finger always keeps the same physical size on the screen. It's the canvas that changes size. You stretch the canvas out. So when you deal with touch, you have to rethink these familiar abstractions. Now the trouble is, right, especially for sort of more abstract things like this that aren't labeled, that aren't simple gestures, is how do you teach these invisible gestures to people, especially when they're somewhat abstract or complex? How do you figure them out? Gestures are unlabeled, so they rely on visual cues or past experience. So the less that a gesture resembles a physical action, touching something, dragging something, the more difficult it is to figure out. More abstract gestures will go overlooked entirely. So we have to train people by using conventions that they already understand. One way to do that, as we'll sort of look at very briefly here, is creating realistic physical interfaces. But understand that with a little help, people will learn to work your interface sight unseen. I mean, we do this all the time. We use interfaces daily that are essentially invisible, or at least in the dark. Who has that sound, by the way, for their alarm clock? Yeah, did you just have a heart attack? Is it? Yeah. So too many of us can even hit that snooze button in our sleep, right? It's muscle memory. It's like typing. In fact, most of us here no longer look at the keys when we type, right? Studies show that if you ask professional typists, which I guess actually we probably all are already, to write down the order of the keys, you can't do it. It's muscle memory now. It's not part of your conscious knowledge. We do it without thinking, right? Access that subconscious knowledge faster than the conscious brain does. The trouble with both of those examples, right, is that we had to learn the clock and the keyboard before we could do this. The layout of the alarm clock, had to know it before you could sort of hit that snooze button in the dark. We had to start with hunt and peck on the keyboards before we could touch type. So nearly everything we know has to be taught, learned, observed, and we rely on cues in our environment to help until we obtain mastery. It's a cutting board called the OCD cutting board. It's for sort of helping people get the precise length and width of julienne vegetables and stuff. It means that you don't have to rely on memory or muscle memory. It's a cheat sheet, right? A reference. This is where we always start. Some kind of physical reference. We're surrounded by these little hints all the time, Sometimes it's a conscious set of tools or personal organization, but others are softer reminders, often social, and not entirely in our control as either designers or consumers. Don Norman's got a new book out called Living with Complexity. It's a great read. He talks about salt and pepper shakers. Which is salt and which is pepper? Who thinks this one is pepper? Yeah. Salt? Who has no idea? All right, about thirds equal right there. So Don actually points out it actually doesn't matter which is correct, because all that matters is what the person who fills them believes, right? I mean, it's arbitrary, it's socially defined, not evenly understood by everybody. So social signifiers only work if everyone knows them. Cultural understanding is messy. And we have uncertainty when we confront this, right? We're forced to proceed with caution, to test the shaker to see if it's salt or pepper, slow down, lose confidence. So our job, as the people who fill the salt and pepper shakers for these interfaces, is to give users confidence that they understand the system, sort of move efficiently and confidently to their goal. So UI conventions are social conventions, social constructions. And we can't give our machines kind of perfect intelligence about user expectations, but we can at least give them good manners, right? To help prevent confusion among our guests if we're the host at this little dinner party. One solution is labeling. An even better solution is no labels at all, right? Just this instant intuitive understanding. I know what it is because I can see it. The content itself is the label. You want salt? Grab the salt. No middleman involved, no processing of labels or signs. This is still a cultural norm, by the way, because we know that salt and pepper go together. If it's sugar, we're kind of lost, right? But who needs a control when you have the content itself? And this is one of the great things about touchscreen interfaces. You see this in the Gallery app on the iPhone, for example. No controls here, just a really dense presentation of thumbnail images. Which image do you want? Touch it and see it. Now, glass salt shakers and photo thumbnails are obvious visual cues, evident calls to action. And what about sort of more abstract behaviors like those pinch gestures we saw? This is where we often start. Instructions. This is where you start when you use the Popular Science magazine app for the first time. So you have to slog through all these controls before you get to step one. New Yorker does the same. Lots of apps do this, asking you to read about how to work every bit of the app before you can even understand what it does for you. This isn't only premature, but it also makes the app feel more complicated than it actually is. Coy Vin, the former design director for New York Times Digital, sort of poked a little fun at these by showing his cheat sheet for how to use a magazine. I like this. The page is stacked on the left. Displays your reading history here. Note here's unread content. And of course, you can bookmark things by sort of pulling it over. Again, it's instead of making it easier, right, it makes the thing seem more complicated than it actually is. Running low on time. I'm going to show you this anyway, just because it's fun. Norwegian TV had this comedy sketch many years ago titled Medieval Help Desk. The book has just been invented, and so longtime scroll readers are a little confused. So this monk has called the help desk for support, and we're going to come in at the middle just after he's gotten a quick tutorial, and he thinks he's got it. I'll read the captions because I'm not sure you can see it.
Litt grann tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk. Ja, av og til litt. Ja, flott. Ja, men du, en til før du går. Så må jeg gå gjennom en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner sånn, og så, hva har du kaller det? Jeg blar frem og tilbake, og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den. Flott, kjempefint. Ja, men du, vent, ikke sant? Nå er det sånn igjen, nå får jeg ikke åpnet den. Det er ikke likegyldig, det altså. Åpne fra den siden der. Sånn. Der nå. Ja vel. Har du lest manualen, eller? Manualen? Skal jeg følge med som brukerverden? Åja, den ja. Ja, men ikke sant, der har du samme problemet.
Look, even if the guy could have read the manual, he wouldn't have. This is why most people only have sort of a partial understanding of their tools. It's also why most people think Monopoly is this long, tortuous game that never ends. Because people don't play by the rules. If people actually read the instructions and played by the letter, the game actually goes pretty quickly. But this doesn't exactly promise the greatest evening of fun. Why don't we read manuals? We're impatient. We have a goal. And sort of reading the instructions seems like a diversion from that goal, even when we could actually get there faster. Keep the instructions, but remember they're a reference, not a primary learning tool. I'll just sort of skip this guy.
This app.
The best interfaces, of course, require no instruction. Nature itself doesn't have labels. If you do something wrong out in the world, often nothing happens. You push a door the wrong way, nothing happens. We're sort of smart enough to figure out how to pull it the other way. Nature's a really complex interface that we seem to manage, right? We learn how the world works by trial and error and gain confidence as we explore it. So I think that's one sort of advantage to using physical interfaces, these so-called skeuomorphic interfaces, to provide cues about how things work. Apple really emphasizes this a lot in its interface guidelines, right? Make it realistic. But that means that you have to do more than just sort of throw Photoshop textures at it. See this in Apple's own apps. You know, the iPad calendar. Oh, it's great. It's a lovely date book. Very pretty, and of course, you naturally know how to use it, right? You just swipe to turn the page. Oh, hang on a sec. Yeah, no. Doesn't do anything. You have to hit that tiny little button down in the lower right there to sort of like make it go forward. It's even worse for the calendar app, you know, it's an address book. Same here, you go to turn the page, you start deleting content. So here the book metaphor is this confusing misdirection. It creates expectation that it works like a book, but it really works through desktop-style conventions. So if you go this route of aping a physical object, you gotta embrace the metaphor. Think hard about these new interaction opportunities it proposes. In user testing, I see this all the time. You know, if it looks like a physical object, people will try to interact with it like one, which means that you have to follow through. Don't make me tap buttons if the interface suggests otherwise. Meanwhile, you've got mini magazine apps that are too literal, right? Very true to the original print artifact, basically like PDFs. Clear exactly how to use them, often difficult to find the table of contents, sort of really means that you have no random access. One of the great advantages to digital content. As you embrace these realistic interfaces, don't forget to enable what digital media can do best, kind of unshackling us from these linear reading experiences. Here's an example of tweaking the real world to digital advantage. This is the Sydney Morning Herald. And it looks, you know, very familiar, like a newspaper. You have these sort of summary pages that you can swipe through as indicated by the page indicators down at the bottom. But even better, you can quickly scan each and every article in today's edition by just sort of going through the content. So it sort of has the familiarity of the newspaper, but also this really easy access to sort of remote, to the random access of the content. You guys, I've gone way over. Nobody's kicking me off, though. I don't know if there's anybody in this room. Oh, there's a coffee break. I'm keeping you from coffee. All right. I will let you go. Thank you very much for indulging me. But I was going to talk about how you should play more video games, which I just want to leave